When the world thinks of Sinach, it thinks of praise. Her voice has become one of the defining sounds of modern worship, a simple, unassuming voice that carried an anthem across continents and into hearts. Songs like Waymaker have become more than radio hits, they are the soundtrack of faith for an entire generation. But behind the refrains that lifted millions, there was always a quieter story, a marriage, a household, a husband who chose to walk a different path beside her. For years, the silence around that household grew louder than any interview or public statement. What began as gentle curiosity became speculation, and that speculation eventually demanded an answer. This is the story of how whispers became a question, how a private confession went public, and how two people who lived much of their life under the public's eye chose, slowly and deliberately, to make their private work the thing that ultimately set them free. When Sinach's name rose around the world, people celebrated the simplicity of her worship. Her music did not chase the spotlight found it. Choirs and congregations in Lagos, London, Seoul and Sao Paulo sang the same choruses on the same nights. Ordinary people filmed tearful versions on their phones and posted them to the internet. Pastors, worship leaders and spiritual influencers called the songs anointed and immediate. In those early seasons, her husband, Pastor Joe, was present but quiet. A pastor known and respected in his own circles, but rarely the subject of headlines. As her global profile rose, he remained a familiar but private figure, often described by those close to him as steady, prayerful and modest. He was the man who prayed in the background, who supported a ministry that now moved across time zones and continents, but he rarely sought the spotlight. That choice, to remain private beside a very public wife, was admired by some and puzzled others, but at first it simply seemed like two faithful people walking their callings in different ways. Over time, the difference in public visibility between the two of them became a question mark in many online conversations. For fans, the image of a shared stage or shared interviews had long been part of the ideal, the wife and husband ministering together, the couple who testified both in worship and in life. But instead of joint appearances and frequent public affection, what people saw was silence. Pastor Joe's name rarely trended. He did not post long captions under his wife's videos, and he rarely featured on red carpets. In an age where every family moment is curated and shared, their hush felt conspicuous. Questions followed: was he a private man? Was the marriage strained? Did ministry pressure cause a rift? The internet is a hungry thing. When it finds a silence, it fills it with its own theories. Social pages and forums that specialized in gospel culture began to ask the kind of questions that can feel small in a coffee shop and enormous in a worldwide community. Some defended the couple, insisting that privacy is sacred. Others speculated that there was trouble at home. A delicate subject slowly became a public obsession. It is vital to say here that many who knew the couple insisted that silence did not equal scandal. Friends and colleagues in ministry repeatedly told interviewers and reporters that Pastor Joe had chosen a life of quiet faith and that Sinach's choice to keep marriage private should be welcomed rather than interrogated. But the shape of fame is to be noticed. The more people scrutinized, the more the narrative metastasized. Headlines that began as questions turned into assumptions for readers who wanted the story to be dramatic. Rumors about jealousy, about a husband who was insecure about his wife's brilliance, began to circulate in comment sections and in WhatsApp groups. A few bloggers suggested that Pastor Joe had tried to limit his wife's travel for the sake of family. Others insisted he was jealous. Both positions assumed knowledge of moments that only the couple truly lived. The strain between public curiosity and private dignity grew. For years, Pastor Joe did what he had always done. He stayed mostly silent. He continued his calling as a pastor, supporting ministry in ways that did not always seek attention. Those close to him described this choice as brave, an intentional protection of the shared human space between man and wife. But when a silence extends for too long under intense scrutiny, it gathers meaning of its own. As the speculation increased, some framed his absence as evidence that something more was wrong than mere privacy. Rumors began to spin, not fueled by facts, but by a hunger for explanation. When friends were pressed, many chose not to answer. They answered not because they wanted to hide the truth, but because the truth felt sacred and complicated. It belonged to two people walking their faith in imperfect time. The turning point arrived not with a press conference or a PR release, but with a quiet moment at a men's ministry gathering in Lagos. The gathering was ordinary in its outward appearance. Pastors and church leaders had gathered to discuss the realities of supporting spouses in ministry, to pray and to build one another up. The group was intimate, the kind of room where leaders exchange burdens rather than headlines. Silence hung in the air while they spoke about the stresses created by public ministry. The room was listening when a man asked what many had been feeling without saying, "How do husbands lead when their wives lead nations in worship?" All eyes turned toward Pastor Joe, a man known in that circle but not accustomed to being the center of online speculation. Few expected him to stand. Fewer expected him to speak. When he did speak, he spoke without fanfare and with a humility that seized every ear. He said that for years he chose silence because he did not want to add fuel to rumors, but that silence had cost him a truth of its own. He admitted feeling invisible at times, a quiet testimony that cut deeper than the tabloids. He confessed that the weight of watching his wife minister on large stages, adulated and applauded, while he remained in the quieter rooms of local ministry, had sometimes felt like erasure. Yet he was careful to distinguish pain from sin. His words were not accusations, nor bitterness. Instead, they were an honest reckoning with what happens to a marriage when one partner navigates global celebrity and the other navigates pastoral service at home. It was the kind of vulnerability that makes people, in the room and beyond, want to lean in and listen. What happened next is an example of how private truth, once spoken, moves with a velocity the speaker rarely expects. Somebody in that meeting recorded the confession. It was a small, intimate testimony, a man telling other men about the cost of quiet. Within hours, the recording had traveled into the internet's broad reach. Clips surfaced on WhatsApp, uploaded to YouTube, and shared across all manner of social feeds. What had been a pastoral talk in an intimate space suddenly became a global headline. The leak ignited the very frenzy Pastor Joe had been trying to avoid. People responded with the full range of emotions: compassion, cynicism, curiosity, and critique. Many commended him for stepping out of silence and naming his struggle. Others accused him of opportunism, branding the confession as a late attempt to reclaim relevance. The problem with public discourse is that it rarely holds nuance, it prefers declarations over complexity. The reaction was seismic because it tapped into something larger than the two people at the center of the storm. It touched on the fragile dynamics in many ministry marriages where spotlight and shadow do not balance easily. Questions emerged: can a husband maintain his pastoral identity when his wife ministers to multitudes? When does privacy become complicity? These discussions had merit, but too often they drifted into the realm of personal speculation. In the immediate aftermath of the leak, comment threads were divided between those who praised Joe for honesty and those who suggested that he should have spoken sooner. The rhetoric often left little room for the truth of an intimate life negotiated under pressure. People tend to want a simple story, scandal or sanctity, when real life is usually a blend of both. While the internet raged, Sinach responded as she often does, not with explanation, but with worship. 3 days after the leak, she stepped on a stage in front of a large worship gathering. She did not deliver a long statement. She did not post a lengthy caption. She sang. Her voice trembled with the kind of vulnerability only someone who carries both praise and pain can muster. The song she chose was familiar, filled with lines about God's presence in the storms. She sang as if each lyric was a prayer of both confession and plea. The crowd felt it, social media felt it. Videos of that night picked up millions of views because people saw, in her tears and in the way she carried each line, an unspoken conversation answered in worship. That response altered the narrative in small but significant ways. Rather than escalating into public animus, their story moved into a more spiritual space, the language of prayer, of intercession, of private healing steps. A social media follow, a wedding photo shared with no caption, a verse posted quietly. These micro gestures were analyzed across the internet like signals from a ship at sea. Fans read hope into them. Critics read strategy. Friends read love. The difference in interpretation highlights how public life compresses complexity into snapshots and challenges us to read the whole album rather than one single shot. Behind the scenes, sources close to the couple said the worship night had affected both of them deeply. Sinach, moved by the candor and by the public response, chose to step toward her husband in ways that were not performative but intentional. Pastor Joe, humbled by being heard and frightened by being leaked, felt exposed in ways he had always feared. Yet both of them sensed that what they needed was not headlines but healing. They sought counsel from a senior pastor they both trusted, a leader familiar with both their ministry context and their human fragility. In private sessions, they brought the kind of honesty that had been missing for years, not a search for repetition of past patterns, but for renewal of a commitment under the pressure of exposure. It matters to note that nothing in private healing is easy. There were long conversations about identity, about ego, about the subtle wounds that form when applause becomes a currency, and when absence of applause becomes a question of worth. They spoke honestly about roles, about what it means to be a husband when your wife is called to sing in stadiums and your own calling is in community prayer rooms. They spoke about the cultural expectations placed on pastors and on pastors' wives, about how ministry sometimes elevates and sometimes isolates. They grieved not only the lost ease of their earlier years, but also the ways in which silence had allowed misperceptions to grow. The process was not a trending hashtag, it was complicated work done in rooms with charity and scripture and prayer. Over time, those rooms birthed small acts of reconciliation. The couple started appearing together more often at ministry events, not to perform for cameras, but to practice presence. A conference in Abuja, a modest event by celebrity standards, became a defining moment. They walked in holding hands, the crowd sensing something more than a PR moment, rose as if greeting not fame, but restoration. It was a public scene that felt intimate precisely because it was real. When they stood together during worship, Sinach on the mic and Pastor Joe at her side, people sensed that what had once been a narrative of absence had moved toward a testimony of unity. At that Abuja gathering, Sinach premiered a new song, a piece that would later be known to listeners as Stronger Together. It was not slick production intended for the charts. It was raw, an honest reflection about walking through fire and finding refinement, about holding together despite the world's attempts to divide. The song resonated precisely because it did not pretend the past did not hurt. Instead, it acknowledged pain, and then leaned on the power of faith, repentance, and mutual accountability. Fans who were quick to judge before were quieter after. Some admitted their own participation in the rumor mill and apologized. Many told different stories about the couple afterwards, stories that centered on grace rather than gossip. Two things became clear in the months that followed. First, private healing rarely makes dramatic headlines. It makes gentle, stubborn changes that accumulate over long seasons. Second, ministry that survives public storms does so by redirecting the narrative from celebrity to service. Where once their public image had been defined by concert posters and social feeds, their new identity came to be measured by mentoring, counsel, and the slow work of rebuilding trust. They opened a small initiative aimed at supporting ministry couples, an incubator of sorts for married leaders who had to navigate public expectations while maintaining private integrity. The initiative focused on counseling, boundary setting, and community accountability. It became an unlikely haven for leaders who had suffered in silence. In essence, what had once looked like weakness became the soil of purpose. Of course, not everyone was convinced. There remained skeptics who saw the couple's public moves as image repair rather than spiritual renewal. That skepticism reflects a broader cultural challenge, the tendency to assume the worst until we are shown otherwise. Yet among pastors and leaders who attended their counseling sessions or benefited from the initiative, the testimony was different. They found in Sinach and Pastor Joe a couple no longer interested in optics but determined to offer practical help. Their joint ministry to other couples became, in time, a more enduring narrative than any clickbait story that once surrounded them. An important dimension of their restoration was how they chose to communicate, not with lengthy press statements, but with intentional relational acts. They shared a simple wedding photo without commentary, they followed one another again on social media, and they posted scripture passages at times that seemed more like personal reminders than media strategy. The posts read like private letters made public, short scriptures, words about faithfulness, and images of quiet moments. People who followed them noticed the difference. This was not the kind of carefully framed PR campaign, orchestrated by teams. It was slow, human, and unmistakably genuine. As their private narrative re-entered public space, the conversation around them subtly changed. Media pieces started to shift tone from "why the silence" to "what can we learn?" Instead of trolling comment threads, some writers focused on spiritual lessons relevant to wider audiences: the cost of ministry marriages, the importance of boundaries in public life, and the necessity of counseling when parenting, faith, and fame intersect. Seminars and panels began to include segments on vulnerability, asking how leaders could be honest about pain without collapsing under it. In this way, what had started as speculation became fuel for important constructive conversations about pastoral care in the modern era. Perhaps the most poignant moments of this season were not in stadiums or on social feeds, but in small, unremarkable places. A late-night phone call where two weary adults apologized for the ways fame had hardened them. A morning breakfast where both laughed about a shared memory. A prayer meeting where they shed tears, instead of posturing for cameras. Those moments captured a truth that public observers often miss: restoration is not a single spectacle, but a series of quiet acts, each one a decision to choose grace over grievance. It is the daily practice of presence, rather than the once-in-a-lifetime dramatic gesture. In that humble cadence they found a new ministry. Rather than being defined by an era of silence and speculation, they began to be known for their capacity to translate that season into a ministry of empathy. They hosted retreats for ministry couples, wrote freely about boundaries and forgiveness, and taught a generation of worship leaders that vulnerability does not disqualify you for service, it qualifies you to serve with more humility. Their story, once a case study in curiosity, became a manual in recovery. Pastors and worship leaders, who had once feared speaking about the pressures of public ministry, started attending their events in greater numbers, grateful for guidance that was practical and human. One judge of their journey was time. Months swelled into a year, and preservation of the marriage was less about social signals and more about consistent actions. Each time they chose honesty over hiding, each time they placed therapy over pride, each time they prayed together rather than performatively for cameras, the foundation between them strengthened. They did not return to the old rhythm because old rhythms had contributed to the initial drift. Instead, they crafted a new rhythm: times of public ministry balanced with protected spaces of private conversation, a ministry calendar that honored family, and roles that allowed each of them to exercise unique callings without eclipsing the other's identity. Critically, they also learned to speak publicly about their journey in ways that protected both privacy and truth. They resisted the temptation to dramatize every turn for followers. Where before silence had become a vacuum filled by rumor, now discernment guided their public voice. When they did speak, they spoke with invited contexts: therapeutic panels, pastoral counseling sessions, or carefully chosen interviews where nuance was possible. Those public moments served not to satisfy curiosity, but to model how two leaders could hold one another accountable and still love fiercely. In these exchanges, the language shifted from defense to teaching. By the time enough seasons had passed, the narrative that had once threatened to define them now acted to expand their influence. Instead of being the story that centered on what the world thought or said about them, the couple's testimony began to be cited in churches and counseling centers as a real example of grace under pressure. Pastors used their names and sermons to encourage humility. Relationship counselors referenced their learning curve as a case study in public boundary setting. Worship leaders thanked them for modeling that spiritual gifts are meant to serve people, not to satisfy egos. A part of their ongoing work was acknowledging the harm done by a culture that treats marriage like content and private life like consumable entertainment. They challenged their colleagues in ministry to become guardians of one another's well-being, rather than bystanders who mindlessly amplify gossip. That was an essential pivot, shifting attention from the salacious to the sacred, from spectacle to stewardship. For them, restoration meant not only healing their marriage, but also helping the wider church reconsider how it pertains to the families of public ministers. On certain nights now, when Sinach sings and Pastor Joe sits in the audience, there is a visible difference. They no longer navigate the stage as two figures constrained by public expectation. They move with a kind of quiet solidarity. One is not missing while the other shines. Instead, they shine differently together. Their hands may not always clasp in front of cameras, but their gestures are gentler, and their looks are often filled with the recognition of shared struggle. Those who have watched this transformation in close quarters describe it as holy, not in the sense of perfection, but in the sense of a life offered back to God, worse and better for having been broken and healed. Their story also created a rippling effect beyond their immediate community. The public conversation about ministry families expanded to include a wider range of voices: wives of pastors who had felt invisible, husbands of famous women who had felt relegated to supporting roles, and children who had grown up in households where the public and private intersected with messy intensity. For many, the couple's journey offered permission to ask for help without shame. That is a rare and countercultural legacy in any religious subculture where the expectation of unassailable strength can hide deep wounds. It is important to reflect on the devil of small choices and the blessing of small rituals. The couple began to ritualize simple acts of restoration: a weekly honest conversation without an audience, a monthly counseling session, a commitment to pray together before major ministry events, and a covenant to protect home time as sacred. These practices, humble in form, proved transformational. They reclaimed marriage as a holy work warranting attention, not a PR asset requiring upkeep. As the public thirst for spectacle waned, the couple's social feeds became less about news and more about a ministry of care. They posted testimonies from couples who had attended their retreats, shared tips on spiritual resilience, and invited other ministry leaders to candid dialogues. Where once a single leaked audio had exploded into viral conjecture, now the world received measured teachings and the testimonies of healing hearts. The couple demonstrated that public attention could be rechanneled into public good. None of this means that every critic softened. Some remained convinced their initial suspicions were correct, others continued to question the timing of each public step. But for most who observed for the long arc, the gradual change was convincing in a way a sensational headline never could be. The restoration was not a single day, but a steady arc of accountability, confession, and confession followed by renewed service. That slow work is often invisible to the casual reader but deeply visible to the people in the pews, the families in their conferences, and the ministry leaders who had once prayed for better models of pastoral care. Their final pivot was perhaps the most telling. Where before this story had been framed as a marital drama, in which one partner was accused of being silent and the other of being distant, they now launched a collaborative ministry for couples specifically designed for leaders in public life. The program emphasized coaching, setting healthy boundaries with media, safeguarding family time, and establishing spiritual practices to prevent the drift that had almost cost them dearly. It was a humble effort with an ambitious heart, to reduce the number of marriages broken by the collision of celebrity and ministry by teaching leaders how to steward influence instead of being devoured by it. In those training rooms, they were not celebrities, they were mentors. They did not deliver polished speeches, but they shared raw stories: times when they were selfish, moments when silence had meant protection, and when it had meant avoidance, and the ways a counselor's question or a shared prayer changed a trajectory. Couples who attended the workshops often remarked that the honesty in the room felt like medicine. "We came to learn how to get our spouse off the stage and back into the home," one attendee joked, and then wept in gratitude when she described how a single week of counseling saved her marriage. The country of their influence shifted subtly but surely. Sermons began to include practical care for pastoral families. Conference planners started building spouse care into their budgets, and the church culture around public figures began to bend toward mercy rather than mockery. None of this absolved every mistake made in the past, but it created structures that reduced the likelihood of those mistakes repeating. Through this long season, Sinach and Pastor Joe came to model a different kind of leadership, one framed by the discipline of humility. They demonstrated that faithfulness is not always glamorous, that courage sometimes looks like therapy, and that restoration can be more compelling than scandal. In time, the story that had once been a wearying headline transformed into a teaching narrative embraced by pastors, worship leaders, and couples across denominations. When they speak now, there is a different cadence in their voices. Sinach's singing still draws crowds and channels the kind of worship that turns strangers into family. Pastor Joe's teaching is quieter but no less powerful. People listen because his voice now carries the depth of experience that only a tested life provides. They no longer attempt to convince the world of their love, instead, they invite it to witness a faith that has kept them even when they were hard to love. The narrative that began with silence ended not with more noise but with testimony. What had initially been a private matter leaked into public view, and once exposed, it became an opportunity for them to teach, to heal, and to build. The couple's life together, before, during, and after the leak, offers a layered lesson about fame, vulnerability, and the slow grace of repair. They teach that sometimes the right answer to invasive curiosity is not counterattack but humble repair. They show that a life lived for worship can survive the world's worst curiosities if the couple chooses mercy. Ultimately, the story of Sinach and Pastor Joe is not simply a story about celebrity or rumor. It is a human story about two imperfect people trying to love one another under the pressure of public gaze. It is about how silence can be both protection and prison, and how truth spoken in safe spaces can lead to the kind of healing that headlines cannot replicate. In a culture that loves scandal, their choice to convert crisis into counseling and to transform voyeurism into vocation stands as a rare example, a private struggle turned public ministry. If there is a final lesson in their journey, it is this, that the Christian story is not a narrative of unbroken perfection but of persevering grace. We are a people who fall and rise, we are a people whose marriages are tested and when tended can be refined and redeemed. Sinach and Pastor Joe did not find quick fixes, they found patient fidelity. They moved from silence to speech, from rumor to restoration, and from the pressure of public expectation to the discipline of private repair. Their joint ministry to other couples is their answer to the very question their situation once raised: how do leaders survive when the world watches their every move? In the end, their greatest legacy may not be the songs that first made them famous, though those songs will continue to be sung. Their greatest legacy may be the ministry that rose out of their pain, the conferences, the coaching, the honest conversations that now help others navigate fame, faith, and family. They show that restoration is possible, and that from the debris of rumor and rumor's hurt, something wiser and holier can emerge. When you watch them now, standing together in a small hall, speaking to a couple who has reached the end of their patience, or praying in a quiet room for a leader who feels alone, you will see two people who have learned how to translate scandal into service. You will see a woman who still sings like a river of praise, and a husband who still prays like a rock of steady devotion. Together they teach a generation that love does not require perfection, only persistence, that ministry does not require publicity, only faithfulness, and that when silence breaks, truth spoken in a spirit of humility can lead to an even louder chorus of grace. Their story began in worship, was tested by silence, and was renewed in prayer. It will not end with a trending hashtag. It will end, if there is an ending at all, in the slow work of rebuilding, in shared counsel, and in restored ministry, quiet, steady, and full of grace. In a world that sometimes mistakes noise for truth, Sinach and Pastor Joe have chosen the harder path. They have chosen to let their lives be the sermon.